of the many volunteers. Romania's new government today defended the speedy execution, saying it feared Ceausescu's secret police might try to free him. NBC's Arthur Kent reports from Bucharest.
He'll see in the new year in his grave, the people chant, upon hearing reports of their former dictator's execution. Most Romanians today had no doubt how Nicolae Ceausescu will be remembered.
As a black spot, a dark period, something awful that stopped us and made us like slaves only for him.
Romanian television broadcast again today pictures of Ceausescu and his wife Elena being judged by a special military tribunal. Found guilty, the announcer says, of crimes including genocide against the Romanian people.
That's why the people is still fighting in the streets, and they will fight until the destruction of this band of traitors of the country who joined with foreign forces to organize this coup d'etat.
Ceausescu scoffed in disgust at the death sentence. "We do not recognize you as a court," he said.
I will not answer these questions because I will not answer. And no one fired against the people in the Palace Square in Bucharest.
His wife said, "How can you do this? I was like a mother to you." But today, this image of the man once known as the tyrant. He and his wife, say Romanian TV, were shot to death yesterday afternoon. The dictator's legacy was violence, firefights sparked by his Securitate gunmen. Today was the first day people could safely return to where so many fell. This woman said she had watched last week as 4 students were shot dead before her by Securitate snipers. Grief turned to anger in this crowd in Bucharest today when a Securitate agent fell into their hands. There are unconfirmed reports that captured Ceausescu loyalists are being executed around the country. As violent as the events of the past week have been, many Romanians regard the firestorm that has swept Bucharest and the rest of the country as essential to clearing away the old regime. Now, the larger challenge, choosing a way forward for the new Romania. Arthur Kent, NBC News, Bucharest.
The Bush administration said today it was sending $500,000 in emergency medical supplies to Romania for the victims of the fighting there. More than a dozen countries have now recognized Romania's provisional government, which today announced its leadership and a promise for free elections by next April. Elections are something Romanians look forward to, but as NBC's George Lewis reports, there are other, more immediate needs to be met as well.
A father and daughter who were separated during the heaviest fighting in Bucharest reunited this morning. All over the city, as the gunfire died down, there was a sense of relief. At the old Communist Party Central Committee headquarters, laborers were demolishing the sign on front of the building. From now on, the communists will have to compete with other parties for their share of power. Inside Ceausescu's offices there, soldiers have taken over, inspecting the old government's records and belongings, conducting guided tours for the press, and expounding on the evils of the Ceausescu regime. It is kind of an organized anarchy, sometimes with no one in charge, sometimes with everyone in charge. The provisional government, the National Salvation Front, introduced the new leadership today. It is headed by one of Ceausescu's old political enemies, former Communist Party Secretary Ion Iliescu. At the moment, the National Salvation Front is running the Romanian government out of here, the studios of state television. An unusual situation, but according to one of the TV commentators, these are unusual times. Because of how they're being used, the studios are tightly guarded by the army. People who come here have to go through a series of elaborate security checks. The new government officials see radio and TV as their vital links to the public as they struggle to get organized.
People are starting now to organize, to get together, exchange ideas, to start a process which normally takes a lot of time.
Stores in Bucharest reopened today with long lines of people trying to buy food. Under Ceausescu, there were always long food lines and lots of empty shelves. The new government will be under pressure to do better.
Everybody fought for democracy. So we got to manage it, and we got to go forward for our liberty, for our good, for a better life.
Out in Romania's countryside, another challenge awaits the government: the need to modernize the antiquated system of agriculture. Farmers here are elated at the prospect of new liberties. They hope that their children can grow up in a society that is just and free and prosperous. Whether that hope is realized will be the ultimate test for the new government. George Lewis, NBC News, Bucharest.
With emotions running so high in Romania, there was an impassioned debate at the Bucharest television station over whether to show the goriest pictures of the Ceausescu execution. The younger members of the staff wanted to show everything, including the firing squad in action. Older members fought to keep those pictures off the air. The Soviet Communist Party today directed Mikhail Gorbachev to go to Lithuania to deal with the political crisis in that Soviet republic. Last week, Lithuanian communists declared an independent party. Gorbachev has accused the Lithuanians of playing up to nationalist separatist forces. Also coming up on NBC.
Now replaces former communist leader Nicolae Ceausescu, whose execution was shown today on Romanian television. He and his wife were killed by a firing squad following a secret military trial. Romanian television has been showing the tape to confirm that the death sentence had been carried out. Secret police forces loyal to the former leader are surrendering, while Romanians are celebrating their new freedom in the streets. It's believed Ceausescu was responsible for the deaths of 60,000 people during his 24-year reign. And a relief effort to Romania by members of Northwest medical teams is on hold tonight. The volunteer group is collecting donations of blood products, antibiotics, and syringes to take to Romania. But without giving them a reason, the U.S. State Department tonight delayed their trip. U.S. Ambassador Punch Green, who left Portland for Romania last month, talked to Northwest medical teams and Channel 2 today. He said the fighting there is easy.
I walked around town for the first time they let me. I went out with 2 security guards. Their students have formed around, and there's a lot of candles lit for the people, for the very brave Romanians who died.
Ambassador Green says he's still not able to return to the U.S. Embassy in Bucharest. Nightline will have more on the situation in Romania right after our newscast.
In Panama,
Children.
This woman was attending the funeral of her 21-year-old friend, Dan Florian Ursu. They think he was killed by snipers during the battle for the television station.
He was a wonderful man. He was different from the other people. I don't know why only special men must die. He died immediately. He was shot in his heart, his great heart.
Dan Florian Ursu, 21 years old, one of 200 people buried today in Bucharest.
Medical supplies from Oregon are being collected for needy Romanians. The U.S. State Department is still deciding whether to send an assessment team to the ravaged country. That team includes a doctor and a pharmacist from Northwest Medical Teams, which is already gathering supplies.
Talking to some of the Romanian doctors, they said that many operations they perform, they lack even the suture material to perform the operations.
With cash donations, Northwest Medical Teams will buy antibiotics, suture material, painkillers, and other medical supplies. Northwest Medical Teams Director Ron Post also said the U.S. Ambassador to Romania, Alan Punch Green, a Portland businessman, took a walk in the streets today and felt, quote, relatively safe.
In Eastern Europe, but can democracy take root in a country that's never known it before? Good evening, I'm Chris Wallace, and this is Nightline. As the street fighting subsides, a provisional government begins to take shape in Romania. But with an economy in shambles, domestic dissent emerging, and no tyrant to oppose, what political direction will the Romanian people take?
This is ABC News Nightline. Substituting for Ted Koppel and reporting from Washington, Chris Wallace.
It looked like a scene from the end of World War II, or perhaps the height of the French Revolution. The bodies of Nicolae Ceausescu and his wife Elena lying crumpled against a firing squad wall. Romanian television broadcast those pictures today, leaving no doubt about the bloody change of power in that country. But if one era is clearly over, there is fear and confusion about where Romania goes next. Ceausescu ruled so brutally for the last quarter century that there is no opposition, no leading figure to rally round. Crowds in Bucharest today were already denouncing the new government as too heavily weighted with communists. And after years of deprivation, with meager rations of food, heat, and electricity, Romanians are going to want some improvements in their lives fast. John Donvan reports from Romania on a dictator's final days and a country's uncertain steps into a new world.
Romania, the fifth communist domino to fall this year, the fifth triumph of the people. But this revolution was not like the others. This one spilled blood. The blood of soldiers and civilians. And today the population saw on television the blood of their president, Nicolae Ceausescu. Ceausescu, a man who in life called himself a god, but whose 24 years in power most Romanians call a hell. It is because of Ceausescu that Romania's revolution is so different. More than rebelling against a system, a set of beliefs, the people were overthrowing a man.
I believe that Ceausescu established the most bizarre and most exaggerated personality cult the world has ever seen, perhaps certainly in the 20th century.
And it is this man who, for many years, was the American government's favorite communist ruler. Because he stood up to the Soviets, refusing, for example, to join the 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia, or to support the Soviet boycott of the Los Angeles Olympics, he was treated by Washington to preferential trading conditions, to financial loans, and perhaps most significant, Washington showed Ceausescu respect.
He was perceived in the West as a man who could perhaps stand up to Moscow and therefore create a division within the Warsaw Pact. He was seen as a man who could weaken the Soviet Empire.
But to the people who fought to topple him this week, Ceausescu was never more than a despot, a man who jailed dissenters, plundered the economy, gave positions of power to his own family, and destroyed the reputation of Romania among the family of nations. His death is one of the few events this week that has made Romanians smile.
It's my happy day, the day of Ceausescu died.
But this is what Ceausescu has bequeathed to his nation. A civil war his army was ill-prepared to fight. Disorder that no one seems equipped to lead the nation away from. Because he'd always favored members of his secret police force with money and privileges, many of them were determined to fight to turn back the revolution against a uniformed army with bad equipment and poor training. Because he destroyed any organized opposition, the collection of people now claiming to lead the nation from a studio at Romanian TV is mostly inexperienced and has yet to make a convincing case for their own authority. Listening to them talk on about democracy and then seeing the streets where a kind of martial law prevails, it can seem that really no one here is in charge.
The revolution was starting from the people, without leader. Was not a leader. Was not possible to have a leader, because if we try to have a leader, the security immediately obtained the information and it was killed.
It will not be easy for Romanians to get past the pain they suffered under Ceausescu, especially in these last few days in the war carried on by his secret police. Thousands have died. Thousands must now be buried. The people say they want democracy, but democracies do not always thrive where passions run high. And here they do run high. This revolution has been born in anger rather than joy. Ceausescu saw to that. I'm John Donvan for Nightline in Bucharest.
When we return, a discussion of events in Romania with the publisher of the first free newspaper there since the overthrow of Ceausescu, and with a State Department official responsible for Romania and the rest of Eastern Europe.
This is
tomorrow, the greenhouse effect, the White House response, and the big debate, if there's a problem at all. Watch ABC's World News Tonight with Peter Jennings tomorrow.
Earlier this evening, we talked with Anton Uncu live from Romania. Mr. Ancu publishes the first free newspaper to be circulated in Romania since Nicolae Ceausescu was driven from power. And we began by asking him whether the Ceausescu loyalists were on the run today in Bucharest.
So the situation is much clearer now, I would say. Ceausescu forces are completely or almost neutralized. There are still a few isolated elements who are completely desperate and have nothing to lose anymore.
We saw some crowds in Bucharest today saying that the new provisional government is too heavily weighted with communists and that they want to see other elements of the country also participate. How much popular support does the new government have?
For the time being, we try to clear the situation, to have some quiet times, and then we'll try to discuss if it's necessary or not necessary to maintain an attitude which would be pro-communist or anti-communist.
Do you believe that this new provisional government can last until elections next spring, or would you expect more anti-communist elements to be added to the government?
It's difficult to make some provisions, but I believe they can resist up to the elections. But there will be some problems. There will be problems because there are some opinions which do not agree with some of the actions taken by the Salvation Committee. But I believe it will be able to stay in place till spring, till the elections.
You are publishing the first free newspaper in Romania in 40 years. How is it being received on the street? Do people finally believe what they are reading in the paper?
Everybody was extremely happy in the street to see a newspaper entitled Free Romania as before, and a newspaper which was published during Romania who was already freed. It was the same title, but a newspaper which was become free, because the exercise of freedom just starts now.
One final question, Mr. Ancu. Your country has very little experience with real democracy. Do you believe that it can now take hold and grow in Romania, that you will not fall back into another form of authoritarianism?
It would be a pity if we couldn't establish democracy and freedom in Romania. It would be really a pity. It won't be easy, of course. This newly acquired freedom to whom with which we are not used, it's a little bit difficult, poses some problems. I would like to mention the fact that we are still feeling a little bit guilty. We are still guilty because we have for so many years just put up with this kind of feudal regime, feudal caste, full of violence, lacking of culture, and greedy. We just put up with the situation, and this is why we are still feeling guilty.
Joining us now in our Washington bureau is Curtis Kamen, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. Mr. Kamen heads the State Department task force that has been monitoring events in Romania round the clock since Thursday night. Mr. Kamen, let me begin by asking you the same question I asked Mr. Ancu. What is the balance of forces now on the ground in Romania? Is the provisional government firmly in charge?
Yes, I think it's quite clear that the Romanian army and the new provisional government have established their authority in just about every part of the country. There are still some pockets of resistance from the security police here and there, but basically the military equation is now shifted distinctly to the new government.
So you don't view those pockets of resistance, the security police, as being any real threat to the control of this provisional government?
They're no threat, I think, to their control any longer. Certainly they can cause further bloodshed, and that's a problem for the new government.
Well, let me ask you about another threat to this new government, and that is the statements in the streets, some crowds chanting in Bucharest that there are too many communists in this provisional government, that there isn't enough reform. How much popular standing does this new government have?
Well, most of the members of the government, which calls itself the National Salvation Front, have broken with Ceausescu a long time ago. But they are either communists or former communists. And this is a revolution or a change of power that took place in the streets as the result of actions of students and of people who were just fed up with the years of Ceausescu and the years of communism. So I think the new government is probably going to encounter some resistance, some opposition, but they seem to be moving in the direction of allowing these people to have a voice, and perhaps the National Salvation Front will broaden itself and they may find a coalition. We really don't know at this point how that's all going to turn out.
Well, let me ask you about that, because in East Germany and in Czechoslovakia we saw precisely the same pattern, the so-called reform communists taking over from the hardliners, trying to maintain control, and the people in the streets saying the revolution has gone too far for that, and eventually the non-communists taking over in the case of Czechoslovakia. We'll see what happens in East Germany. Is that the scenario that you expect to see played out in Romania?
Well, there are a couple of differences. In East Germany and in Czechoslovakia, there were really no reform communists in any position to take over. Whereas there are reform-minded communists in Romania who gradually over the years had been frozen out by Ceausescu. So that would suggest that maybe it's possible for these people to obtain popular support. On the other hand, in GDR and in Czechoslovakia, there was nothing like this violence, and maybe this will be a reason that people will demand much more of a voice for the non-communists. We're just going to have to wait and see.
On the other hand, you also don't have any Havel or any Lech Wałęsa in Romania, as you did in Poland and Czechoslovakia. The lack of any kind of organized non-communist opposition, what impact will that have on the development of democracy in Romania?
Well, I think there is no opposition organized in formal groups, that's true. But the students, the intellectuals, some of the reform-minded people in the party have obviously been talking about this day for a long time. They came forth very rapidly with a program of 10 points of democratization, and they seem to have a good consensus on all of that. So I don't know exactly who the leaders will turn out to be. There is a new president now of Romania, proclaimed by this provisional government. But I think there may be a little more consensus and a little more structure there than we previously suspected.
This new president, Ion Iliescu, who is a communist but who has been on the outs with Ceausescu for almost 20 years, does he have any credibility with the public? Is he even known in Romania?
Yes, I think that's one reason that he was chosen to head this provisional government. He does have a name recognition. He does have a standing with many people, and he is known to have opposed Ceausescu and to have suffered, at least in career terms. Again, it's very hard to know whether that will translate into broad popular support.
The Army, as we mentioned, played a central role in the events of the last few days, and I want to ask you about that in just a moment. And when we return, we'll be joined in our discussion by a Romanian political analyst, now teaching political science in this country. Mr. Tismaneanu came to this country from Romania in 1981 and lectures in political science at the University of Pennsylvania. The Romanian army, as we mentioned, sir, played a central role in the fall of Ceausescu, finally refusing to carry out his orders to fire on the people. How firmly is the army committed to reform now?
First of all, I think that the army has long been humiliated by the Ceausescu regime. In this case, it's clearly a settlement of accounts between the army leadership and the former dictator and his clan. So it's clear that the army is definitely committed to pursuing the path of reforms. It is, however, an army still, packed with political officers, many of them formed in the Soviet Union. It is still an army very much indoctrinated and ideologically influenced by, scientific socialism, Marxism, Leninism, and all the other dogmas. So the problem is to completely de-ideologize the army, to let the army become, I think, that's one of the major requirements, I suppose, of the opposition in Romania, to let the army be indeed an independent force in society, to depoliticize the army.
You raised precisely the issue I want to get to, though. If the political situation doesn't stabilize fast, what is the danger that the army might seize control or back some other authoritarian figure?
Basically, I think that there is a possibility very soon for the army to purge itself of some of the political officers, and I'm not sure if the situation, degenerates into new forms of violence. I'm not that sure that this is a danger. Maybe, after all, the army can ensure a kind of stability in that country, and perhaps, guarantee a minimal form of internal peace. I hope it's not going to be the case, and I very much hope that the provisional government would be able to perform along the lines of what they have promised in their initial platform. That means to organize free elections for April 1990.
Mr. Kaman, how confident are you that the army will play a progressive role in the future of Romania?
Well, I agree with Mr. Tismaneanu that the army has been deprived over the years. They've been in a rivalry with the security police, and they have every reason to support a new government, and I think very few of them had any love for Ceausescu. There is, however, I think very little likelihood that the army itself will want to assert power. Essentially, they are supporting a set of political leaders who have given them the opportunity to get rid of Ceausescu. But I don't see any likelihood that they're going to take power.
Mr. Tismaneanu, the Romanian economy has been ravaged for years with Ceausescu putting the people on very short rations of food and electricity, heat. How dramatically and how quickly do you expect that to change?
Okay, I think that most of the Romanian disaster has been man-made disaster or man-made tragedy, and it's very much linked to Ceausescu's nowadays documented ambitions, I would say even paranoid ambitions of full-fledged independence, total autarky, and so on. So once I dare say that whoever is going to succeed Nicolae Ceausescu as Romania's leader is going to be necessarily, almost objectively, the most beloved leader or the most popular leader in Romanian history. So I think it's very simple, up to a certain extent, for Mr. Iliescu and the new Prime Minister, Mr. Petru Roman. It would be very simple for them. I don't say it's simple in general, but there are some possibilities there that other communist countries do not have at this moment. First of all, Romania is a very rich country. Regardless of the way the Ceausescu tribe or clan or clique or the way you want to call them squeezed Romania of some of its natural resources, it is still a very rich country. Second, Romania, because of Ceausescu's ambition to get rid of the foreign debt, because he didn't want anybody to control his country and object to his human rights policies, because of this, let's say, financial independence acquired by Ceausescu, Romania has at this moment the possibility to get some Western loans. And third, according to a person I trust very much and who used to work for the World Bank for a long time, Romania has quite a positive balance in its trade with the West.
Gentlemen, we're going to have to break in here just for a moment, and we'll continue our discussion in a moment. Between this revolution and all the others in Eastern Europe this fall is that this one was violent. What impact, Mr. Kaman, do you expect that to have on developments in Romania in coming days?
Well, they have a period of recovery, both of the national psychology and also of the economy. There is damage to buildings, infrastructure, and all of that. But I think that most people expected in Romania and elsewhere in East Europe that it wouldn't go as easily in Romania as it did elsewhere. And what they now have to do is try to rebuild on the foundation that they have. In the short term, there will be some differences. I think in the long term, Romania will be very much like the other countries of Eastern Europe, seeking freedom and democracy.
Do you expect a long series of trials, executions, as we saw with Ceausescu?
There will be a problem of reprisals. There have been few of those problems so far elsewhere in East Europe. It's going to be much more difficult for the Romanians to accept the people that have been in the security police, for example, firing on unarmed civilians.
Mr. Tismaneanu, what is the possibility, the likelihood that civil war, as we've seen in the last few days, will break out again in Romania?
I think it's not very likely. I think that what we have seen in Romania, basically, it was the violence exerted by the security police forces, the loyalists of the Ceausescu regime against the population. As an analyst of the Romanian phenomenon, I was expecting, because of the amount of rage that has been accumulated among Romanians, I was expecting Romanians to be, I didn't want it, but I was expecting much more uproar and a kind of almost uncontrolled anarchic development. So far, I would say that the Romanians have behaved very much like their East European peers, and they have reacted, of course, to violence and aggression, brutalities on the part of the security police, but there is very little looting and lynching despite of this extraordinary persecution and, as I said, almost sadistic brutalities.
Mr. Kamin, we only have about 30 seconds left. What do you think is the likelihood that there will be, as now promised, fair, free elections in Romania by next spring?
I think it would be very hard for any government now to deny that to people who have shed their blood to achieve it. And so I look forward to it. I think it's definitely going to happen.
And as in other Eastern European countries, the likelihood that all of the communists will be swept from power?
I wouldn't say that. I think there may be either a combination of communists and non-communists, some sort of a coalition, maybe a multi-party system with several parties sharing power.